Daisies are a familiar sight at this time of the year in the UK, popping up in lawns and on grass verges. Their proliferation, particularly on lawns, makes them an unwanted plant for some gardeners. Now the flowers, or Bellis perennis, are also known as bairnwort, bruisewort, common daisy, English daisy, garden daisy, and sometimes wild daisy. Having multiple names for the same plant makes it quite awkward when looking at a Language of Flowers dictionary. In the 1867 edition of Mrs. Burke's dictionary explains that daisies mean innocence, garden daisies mean I share your sentiments, and wild daisies mean I will think of it. So you would need to make sure that you got the right message to the right person. Now the name daisy is believed to come from day's eye, since the flowers open according to daylight, and indeed Geoffrey Chaucer called it the eye of day, while Ben Jonson called them bright day's eyes. Yet they're more often associated with love, childhood and divination. So let's have a look at the folklore behind daisy chains, pulling petals and trampling on daisies in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are rattling along with the folklore of unwanted plants month this month, and after we've done dandelions, celandine and nettles, we're now going to move on to daisies, because quite frankly, there are tons of them where I am. And we're just going to jump straight into the episode. So the first thing I wanted to have a look at is the link between daisies and Christianity. And I'm always quite fascinated by the ways that certain flowers become associated with saints or other parts of Christian legend. And people believe that the tips of the common daisy were pink thanks to the Virgin Mary. And according to legend, she was gathering daisies for Christ when she pricked her fingers, and that's why they're pink. Henry Ellicombe notes a link between the daisy and St Margaret of Antioch, although this is more likely due to the daisy's alternative name of Herb Margaret. Now the flower's French name is Marguerite, which would probably likely explain this connection. But in one depiction in a late 14th century English hours, St Margaret of Antioch wears a leather girdle decorated with daisy-like clasps. Elsewhere, borders of daisies surround images of her, or she's shown alongside the flowers. Now, Juliana Dresvina does note that daisies were popular embellishments in manuscripts, so it's quite hard to tell if they were used specifically to refer to St Margaret or if they were just simply decorative. Now, the ox-eye daisy, which is actually the Leucanthemum vulgare, is associated with St Mary Magdalene, which explains its alternative name of maudlinwort, and it was also sacred to St John the Baptist since it blooms around the summer solstice. And you can tell the difference between the ox-eye daisy and the common daisy, because ox-eye daisies tend to stand quite tall and they're also a lot bigger, whereas common daisies are a lot closer to the ground. We also have the Michaelmas daisy, which is the Aster amelis, and that one was named for St Michael. Now, technically, all three of these plants, while they sound like they're from different families, they are all essentially members of the same Aster family, so they are related. But that is why we've got so many different types of daisy, and it makes the folklore a little bit complicated, because people will give daisy folklore when they're actually talking about the ox-eye daisy, but then they'll mix it with folklore from the common daisy. So I've tried to separate them out and specify which one I mean, but it has been a little bit of a challenge, shall we say. But I think one of the most common associations that people have with daisies of all kinds is daisy chains. And I'm sure we all made them as children, and you essentially picked lots of daisies. You would split the stem, usually with your thumbnail, and then you would thread the next daisy through the slit. And you would just keep doing that until you made a chain that was long enough to either sit on your head or to go around your neck. It was relatively simple fun. But Christina Oakley Harrington actually notes that there was a wider importance of the daisy chain in Somerset and Devon because it could protect a child from being kidnapped by fairies. Now, obviously, I've covered a fair bit of folklore on the podcast over the years about things that people did to try and ward off fairies, and quite frankly I think the daisy chain's probably one of the easiest and the nicest one that you could probably try. But it does add an extra layer of nuance to an otherwise innocent pastime. Now, despite the tendency to pick daisies to make chains, there was a downside for children to doing so, because children who stood on or pulled up daisies would apparently suffer poor growth. And there is also a much more distressing link between daisies and children, and in some folklore, daisies were believed to be the spirits of children who died during or soon after birth, and the flower sprang up to comfort their parents, which could also explain why they're associated with both children and innocence. And also, the further association between daisies and children might explain why it was apparently called bairnwort in the north of England, because obviously up here we say bairn, spelled B-A-I-R-N, which is our word for child. So you can sort of understand why it would then get that link as well. Now, the other common link for daisies is with love, which is hardly surprising since Culpeper attributed the plant to Venus. And at one stage, women apparently decorated their hair with daisies, further linking the daisy with youthful beauty. And I'm sure you can think of that the next time the supremely annoying advert for the Daisy fragrance by Marc Jacobs comes on TV. And if you haven't seen that one, there's 3 models that just keep going, Daisy, 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 over and over again until the word kind of ceases to lose all meaning. It's really irritating. But yeah, think of that next time that advert comes on. But the daisy is strongly associated with the love divination that involves plucking the petals, saying, he loves me not. Now, the answer was essentially whichever part of the charm you landed on for the final petal. Now, we do see it with other plants as well, particularly in art and films and things like that, but it is basically most often linked with daisies. Now, some people think that the plucking game actually began with the ox-eye daisy, but the common daisy became more popular because they are a lot easier to find. They are a relatively prolific plant. You're also not actually plucking the petals, but rather individual flowers, because daisies have composite flower heads, so each head is made up of lots of tiny flowers. Now, I'm going to keep referring to petals so you know what I mean, but I just think that that's a really cool thing about the daisy, that they're actually like loads of flower heads stuck together to make what we think is the flower head. Plants are really cool. Margaret Baker gives an alternative love divination involving daisies. So rather than picking at the petals to determine if a lover actually loves the picker, rather girls might also pick a bunch of daisies, and the number of flowers in the bunch showed the number of years until her wedding. I'm assuming you just simply reached into a clump and grabbed a handful, because otherwise you could just pick up like 2 or something like that. So you don't want to try and game the system, because that never ends well with love divination. Now, daisies also appear in love magic, and keeping a daisy root beneath your pillow was believed to bring back straying lovers, although one would wonder why you'd want to. Christina Oakley Harrington also notes a Somerset charm in which it was ox-eye daisies used to encourage an unfaithful lover to come back, and not common daisies. Meanwhile, wearing a daisy would help you to bring you love, presumably with a faithful person, and whoever picked the first daisy of the season would be wildly flirtatious. Now, given how prolific daisies are, quite how you would know you picked the first one, not really sure, but that's what the folklore says. And here in the UK, the daisy is apparently the flower of the 5th wedding anniversary. And I say apparently because different florists seem to give different lists of flowers for each anniversary, but daisy for the 5th seemed to be the most common one that I'd found. Now, daisies also appear in the myth of Alcestis, the daughter of King Pelias, although the association is actually more recent than antiquity. And Alcestis is quite a lofty figure in Greek literature, her hand in marriage having been won by Admetus with help from Apollo. Now, unfortunately, Admetus forgot to make a sacrifice to Artemis, who cursed him to die. Now, Apollo managed to convince the Fates to change the curse, but they couldn't actually end it completely, because this kind of thing around deciding who should die and when, that's really the Fates' job. And there was an element in quite a lot of the Greek myths that one god couldn't sort of undo the curse or punishment or whatever of another. So even though Apollo is Artemis's twin, he can't do anything other than persuade the Fates to change it slightly, because they had a little bit more power over these things. But the only way that the Fates could really change it is that Admetus could live and avoid the curse, but only if someone offered their own life on his behalf. So obviously they ended up kind of asking everybody who would be willing to give their life up for Admetus, and unfortunately the only person who was willing to do so was Alcestis, and she tendered her life in exchange for that of her husband. Now, in most versions of the story, the gods are incredibly moved and impressed by her sacrifice, and in one particular version they actually allowed her to return to Earth, and Persephone herself actually sends her back from the underworld. And then when the myth finally reached the Middle Ages, it was Geoffrey Chaucer who associated her with the daisy in his Legend of Good Women. And in this particular version, Alcestis is turned into a daisy. And obviously we've covered lots of myths on the podcast about the gods turning people into plants and trees and so on. So the idea of them doing that isn't unheard of. It just isn't really in the tales from antiquity. It does seem to be Chaucer's invention. Now, A.C. Spearing suggests that that explains the romantic symbolism of the daisy, representing, and I quote, a human love which can conquer even death, end quote. Now, it's also a little bit weird because the oxeye daisy is associated with Artemis, and I don't know if Chaucer knew that, but it did seem a little bit strange to turn Alcestis into the plant favoured by the goddess who cursed her husband. But that said, daisies are sometimes referred to as moon daisies, and Artemis is the goddess of the moon, so the choice of the daisy might just simply have been the influence of Chaucer's favourite flower. Now, obviously, I've mentioned there the link with daisies and the moon, and there are a few different weather sayings involving daisies, not as many as I was expecting. And there's apparently one English saying that summer has arrived because you can put your foot on 12 daisies. And according to Margaret Baker, the saying actually refers to spring, not summer. And then elsewhere it said that you knew that spring had arrived because you could put your foot on 7 daisies. So there's a little bit of discrepancy there. And I must say whole clumps of them have come up where I live in April. So I do feel like the spring one is correct, although whether it's 7 or 12 doesn't really seem to matter. Now, that said, because daisies are still blooming in summer when thunderstorms are more common, in some places they are actually called thunderflowers, which I just think is one of the coolest words ever. And the seasons also impacted what daisies meant when it came to dream lore. So dreaming of daisies during the spring or summer meant that good luck was coming, but dreaming of daisies in autumn and winter predicted hard times. And one of the things that if you've listened to any of the other episodes in this little mini-series, you'll have noticed is a lot of these unwanted plants have loads of other uses, be that for medicinal reasons or whatever it might be. And surprisingly, there was actually a little bit less remedy-based folklore about daisies than we saw with something like nettles, although daisies can also be made into a tea as well. And this apparently helps with bronchitis, coughs and inflammation, although as always, I would recommend that you check with a qualified herbalist first. Some people apparently have also in the past applied fresh daisies to the skin to help heal bruises, which explains its old name of bruisewort. And you should bear in mind at this point that arnica and daisies are actually both in the same family, and because arnica has long been noted for its bruise-busting qualities, that use of the daisy actually may make some sense. According to Henry Ellacombe, Pliny discussed the humble daisy, claiming it was an effective treatment for the king's evil, i.e. scrofula, when it was made into an ointment with mugwort. Now, scrofula is actually the inflammation of the lymph nodes in the neck, and if daisy does indeed help with inflammation, then I can also sort of see where their thinking was at with this one. Now, in earlier times, people used common daisy to cure wounds. In some places, it's even called woundwort, reduce liver inflammation or combat gout. Meanwhile, the oxeye daisy was believed to help with various gynecological issues, perhaps due to its links with Artemis, the goddess of women, and it was also used to treat whooping cough and asthma. Now, ultimately, I'm quite surprised that there's not more remedy-based folklore about daisies, considering how prolific they are, and also the fact that they're really easy to recognise, and I think that's one of the advantages with a plant like the dandelion. You can't really mistake it for something else, and it's the same with the daisy. I mean, the oxeye daisy you can confuse with chamomile, but the common daisy, that's pretty much the only plant it's likely to be, so it is quite interesting to see how the folklore around it tends to be more the children's games or the love divination and things like that. So it's quite interesting, as I say, how that one hasn't quite made the leap into that list along with things like nettle and dandelions. However, obviously there are some people who do still swear by it for different uses and so on. But it just goes to show yet again that this plant, which is kind of quite unfairly maligned because it will spoil a perfect lawn, as far as I'm concerned, a perfect lawn is really boring to look at, but it's also essentially a monoculture and is actually really bad in a natural environmental sense. So the more plants that you have in your lawn, the better, really. So as far as I'm concerned, seeing daisies isn't the worst thing ever. Like, there's worse things that you can see in your garden. So that's just my own personal thing. And again, as always, they're good for pollinators. So anything that's good for a pollinator, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing to have in your garden. Next week, we are going to have a look at thistles, and that is going to include 2 different types of thistles, because as I had the problem with the daisies, there is that kind of slippage and crossover where someone says one plant when they actually mean the other and so on. So I'm going to look at both the Scotch thistle and the common thistle because there does seem to be some overlap. So we're going to cover 2 of the types of thistles. And obviously in some places they are actually really quite a problem. So they do fall under that remit of unwanted plants. I did want to have a look at ragwort, but there was hardly anything about them. So that's why I thought, well, I'll pick thistles because there is stuff about them. And that's how we'll round out the folklore of Unwanted Plants Month. If you've got any requests for next month's theme or just something that you'd like to hear, by all means, feel free to drop something in the Google form that's linked in the show notes, which obviously I can then have a look at and see what people are looking for. And if it's something that I haven't done and that there is enough folklore about, then obviously I will consider doing it as well. So there you go. Anyway, you can probably tell my voice is starting to go now. So I will let you go and do whatever you were doing before you started listening to this episode. And I'll see you next week when we finish off this theme with the folklore of thistles. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.